Imagine being a taxi driver on a quiet night thinking it's just another ride, until your passengers turn it into a nightmare. What would you do if danger sat right behind you? Watch till the end to see how this story unfolds and share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have handled it differently? Daniel was finishing his shift as a taxi driver, eager to head home after a long day. His last fare had tipped poorly, and his energy was running low. The city streets were quiet, illuminated by dim streetlights and the occasional passing car. His phone buzzed in its holder, signaling a new ride request. Glancing at the screen, Daniel frowned. The pickup location was in a rough part of town, a place he usually avoided when possible, but declining the ride meant losing out on a good rating and a potential bonus for completing a late-night shift. With a sigh, he accepted the job. As he drove towards the pickup point, his unease grew. The buildings became more run down, the streets emptier, and the dimly lit corners seemed to watch him with silent menace. When he reached the address, his heart sank further. 3 men stood on the curb, their appearance as intimidating as the surroundings. All 3 were bald, wearing white tank tops that clung to their muscular builds. Tattoos snaked up their arms, some depicting symbols Daniel instinctively recognized as hateful. One of the men spotted Daniel's taxi and nudged his companion with a smirk. "That our driver?" he asked loudly enough for Daniel to hear, his tone dripping with mockery. Daniel hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He didn't want to pick them up, but he knew leaving now could lead to trouble. Steeling himself, he unlocked the doors and the men piled in without hesitation. The man in the front seat leaned back lazily, throwing an arm over the passenger seat. "To Stanton Street," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. The other 2 in the back grinned, their expressions unkind. Daniel nodded silently and began driving, his hands firmly gripping the wheel. "So," one of the men in the back started, his tone mocking, "you drive around all night picking people up, huh? Must be nice being so useful." Daniel said nothing, keeping his eyes on the road. He had learned long ago that responding to provocations like this only made things worse. But his silence seemed to egg them on. "Come on, man," the other backseat passenger chimed in. "Don't tell me you're too scared to talk. We're just having some fun." The man in the front seat chuckled, turning to Daniel with a sneer. "He's not scared. He knows his place, don't you, driver?" Daniel swallowed hard but refused to respond. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his breathing steady. The man beside him wasn't done. "See, that's the problem with you people," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can just do whatever you want, work where you want, live where you want, like you're equal to us." The laughter from the back seat was harsh and loud. Daniel gritted his teeth, fighting to maintain his composure. He had dealt with racist passengers before, but the atmosphere in the car was different tonight. Darker, more dangerous. "You know," one of the men in the back said, leaning forward so his face was closer to Daniel's, "we're doing you a favor just being in this car. Guys like you should be thanking us. Without us, you wouldn't even have this job." The other man laughed. "Or anything else for that matter. Bet he grew up in some dump, probably still lives there." Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. These men weren't looking for conversation. They wanted a reaction, and he wasn't going to give it to them. "Hey, driver," the man in the front seat said suddenly, breaking Daniel's train of thought. "You ever hear about that guy a couple of weeks ago? Same as you. Tried to get smart with the wrong people." cops didn't even bother looking for him. Daniel's stomach turned, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'm just here to get you to your destination," he said calmly, hoping to diffuse the tension. The man beside him laughed, a cold, menacing sound. "Yeah, you are. And you'll keep doing what we say if you know what's good for you." Daniel's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The men in the back were grinning, their postures relaxed but predatory. One of them reached into his pocket and pulled out a folding knife, flipping it open and holding it casually in his lap. The other pulled out a lighter and began flicking it on and off, the small flame casting eerie shadows on his face. "You know," the man with the knife said, his tone almost conversational, "guys like you have a habit of disappearing. Nobody notices. Nobody cares." Daniel's breath hitched, but he forced himself to stay calm. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this situation. He remembered the emergency button installed under the dashboard, a safety feature for drivers. If he could reach it without them noticing, it might send a silent alert to the police. The man in the front seat leaned closer, his breath hot against Daniel's cheek. "You look nervous, driver. Got something to hide?" "No," Daniel replied quickly, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Just focused on the road." "Good," the man said, sitting back with a satisfied smirk, "because if you try anything, it'll be the last thing you do." As they neared an intersection, Daniel spotted an opportunity. Pretending to adjust the gear shift, he moved his hand towards the emergency button. His fingers brushed against it, and he pressed it as subtly as he could. A faint beep sounded, barely audible over the hum of the engine and the men's laughter. "You sure you're not up to something?" the man with the knife asked, narrowing his eyes. Daniel shook his head, keeping his gaze fixed on the road. He couldn't afford to give them any reason to suspect him. The intersection loomed ahead, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. Daniel took a deep breath, his mind racing as he prepared for whatever might come next. The tension in the car was suffocating, but he knew he had to stay calm. Help was on the way. He just had to hold on a little longer. The atmosphere in the car grew heavier with each passing minute as the men continued their taunts and insults. Daniel tried to focus on the road ahead, but their voices filled the small space, their words cutting into him like shards of glass. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" the man in the front seat sneered, leaning closer to Daniel. "Sitting there all quiet, pretending like you're some kind of saint. Let me tell you something, driver. You're nothing. Less than nothing." From the back seat, one of the men laughed loudly, his voice echoing in the car. "I bet he thinks he's too good to talk to us. Isn't that right, buddy? You think you're better than us because you've got a job driving a cab?" Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He didn't respond, knowing that any word he said could escalate the situation. He was no stranger to racism, but this was different. This wasn't just hateful words, it was a simmering violence that threatened to boil over at any moment. The man in the back pulled out a knife, flipping it open and holding it up so the blade glinted in the dim light of the car. "Look at this," he said, his voice mockingly cheerful. "You know what happens when people like you get out of line? They get a little lesson, just a reminder of where they stand." The other man in the back seat leaned forward, his breath hot on Daniel's neck. "You ever heard of people like you disappearing? Happens all the time. Nobody cares. Nobody even notices. You'd be just another statistic." Daniel's stomach churned, but he forced himself to stay calm. His mind raced, searching for a way out. He glanced at the rearview mirror, seeing the grins on their faces, the sick satisfaction they took in his discomfort. The man in the front seat reached over and flicked the dashboard with his finger. "You better not try anything stupid, driver. We're watching you." One of the men in the back chuckled darkly, his voice low and menacing. "You know, you should be thanking us. Without people like us, you'd have nothing. No job, no life. We're the reason you even get to sit here and drive this car. Maybe you should show a little gratitude." The man with the knife leaned closer, the blade resting against the back of Daniel's seat. "Gratitude, yeah. Maybe you should say thank you. Or maybe we'll give you a real reason to be thankful." Daniel's hands trembled slightly, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm just here to drive you to your destination, that's all." The man in the front seat laughed, a cold, sharp sound that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. "That's all, huh? You think this is just about driving? Nah, this is about teaching you a lesson. People like you need to learn their place." The tension in the car was suffocating. Daniel's eyes darted to the emergency button under the dashboard, the one he had pressed earlier. He prayed silently that the signal had gone through, that help was on the way. But he couldn't rely on that alone. He had to think, had to stay calm. "You know," one of the men said, his voice mockingly casual, "it'd be a real shame if something happened to you tonight. Out here on these empty streets, no one around to hear you scream. What do you think, guys? Should we give him something to remember us by?" The others laughed, the sound harsh and cruel. The man with the knife slid it closer to Daniel's side, just enough to make its presence impossible to ignore. "Or maybe we let him go, but not before he gives us something in return. What you got in your pockets, driver?" Daniel's voice was calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. "There's nothing in my pockets. You've already taken everything from the front." "Liar," the man snapped, his eyes narrowing. "Pull over, now." Daniel hesitated, glancing at the road ahead. He needed to buy time, to get closer to a main street where the chances of being seen were higher. "I can't pull over here," he said. "It's not safe." "Not safe?" the man in the back seat repeated, his tone mocking. "You're worried about safety? That's funny, coming from someone who's about to lose everything." The man in the front seat pulled a gun from his waistband, pointing it directly at Daniel. "I said, pull over." Daniel's breath hitched, but he nodded, guiding the car towards the side of the road. As he slowed, his mind raced. He needed to think of something, anything, to keep them distracted. The moment the car came to a stop, the man in the front seat grabbed Daniel by the collar, pulling him close. "Now, here's how this is going to go. You're going to sit there, quiet as a mouse, while we figure out what to do with you." The man in the back leaned forward, his knife glinting in the faint light. "Yeah, we'll figure something out. Maybe teach you a lesson you won't forget." Suddenly, faint sirens echoed in the distance. The sound was barely audible at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. The men froze, their expressions shifting from smug confidence to wary tension. "What the hell is that?" one of them muttered, glancing out the window. The man with the gun cursed under his breath. "Cops, did you call them, driver? Huh? Did you?" Daniel shook his head quickly, his voice steady. "No, I didn't call anyone." "Bullshit," the man spat, his grip on the gun tightening. "You think you're smart, don't you? Think you can outsmart us?" The sirens grew louder, the flashing lights of a patrol car appearing in the distance. The men began to panic, their bravado crumbling. "We need to get out of here," one of them said, his voice tinged with fear. "Now." Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. Help was on the way. He just had to hold on a little longer. The wail of sirens drew closer, and the flashing lights in the rearview mirror grew brighter with every second. The men in the car were no longer taunting or laughing. Their tension was palpable. The man in the front seat clenched his jaw, his eyes darting to Daniel as if blaming him for their predicament. The man with the gun gestured frantically, his voice sharp and filled with panic. "Drive faster! Lose them!" he barked, pointing the weapon directly at Daniel. The cold metal of the barrel was a chilling reminder of how thin the line was between control and chaos. Daniel took a deep breath, steadying his trembling hands. "This car can't outrun a police cruiser," he said calmly, his tone deliberate. "They'll catch up no matter what." "Shut up and drive," the man snapped, leaning closer, his face inches from Daniel's. "If they stop us, it's over for you too." In the back seat, one of the men was pacing the limited space, his knife still in hand. "I told you this was a bad idea. We should have just taken the damn money and left him," the other man snarled, grabbing his arm. "Shut up. We're not done yet. We just need to figure out how to get out of this mess." Daniel glanced at the road ahead. They were nearing a busier intersection, where the glow of street lights and the presence of other cars offered a faint hope of safety. But with the gun pointed at him and the men on edge, he had to be careful not to provoke them further. He slowed the car slightly, making it appear as though he was complying, while internally strategizing his next move. The sirens were now deafening, the police car clearly in pursuit. The man in the front seat banged his fist against the dashboard in frustration. "I said, drive faster. Take a left, now." Daniel deliberately hesitated. "There's traffic on the left," he lied. "If we go that way, they'll box us in." The man's eyes narrowed, but before he could argue, the police cruiser pulled up alongside them, its lights casting a strobe-like effect inside the car. A voice boomed from the loudspeaker. "Pull over immediately. This is the police." Panic erupted inside the taxi. The man with the gun pressed it harder against Daniel's temple. "Don't stop. Keep going." "They've already seen us," Daniel replied, his voice firm despite the terror coursing through him. "If we run, it'll only get worse. They won't stop chasing." The man with the knife swore loudly, turning to his companions. "We need to bail. Now." "Shut up," the gunman growled. "Nobody's bailing. We're getting out of this clean." Daniel saw his chance. As the police car edged closer, he suddenly hit the brakes hard, sending everyone lurching forward. The gunman lost his balance, and the weapon fell from his hand, clattering onto the floor. The man in the back seat cursed, his knife slipping from his grasp as he grabbed at the seat in front of him for support. Before anyone could react, the police car screeched to a halt behind them and officers poured out, their weapons drawn. "Hands in the air! Step out of the vehicle slowly!" one of them shouted, his voice commanding and unyielding. The men in the taxi froze, their earlier bravado replaced by fear and confusion. "What do we do?" one of them whispered, his voice trembling. The gunman glared at Daniel, his face contorted with anger. "This is your fault," he hissed before reluctantly raising his hands. The others followed suit, their movements slow and begrudging. The doors opened, and one by one they stepped out under the watchful eyes of the officers. Daniel remained in his seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. One of the officers approached, his gun lowered but still at the ready. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone softer than before. Daniel nodded, his voice shaky. "I'm fine. They had weapons, a gun, a knife." The officer nodded, signaling to his colleagues. "We've got them. You're safe now." The men were quickly handcuffed and searched, their weapons confiscated. The gunman shot Daniel one last venomous glare as he was led to the police car. "You think you've won?" he spat. This isn't over." Daniel didn't respond. He simply watched as the men were taken away, the weight of the night finally catching up to him. His hands trembled as he released the steering wheel, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. The officer returned, offering a reassuring smile. "You handled that well. Not everyone could have stayed that calm in your situation." Daniel let out a shaky breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't have a choice." The officer nodded, his expression understanding. "You're a brave man. If you need anything, let us know." As the flashing lights of the patrol cars began to fade into the distance, Daniel sat in silence, the events of the night replaying in his mind. He knew he had narrowly escaped something far worse. Gathering his composure, he started the car and headed home, the city's quiet streets offering a brief moment of solace after the storm. Daniel drove home in silence, his hands still trembling slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. The adrenaline that had carried him through the ordeal was wearing off, leaving a heavy exhaustion in its place. The city's streets were quieter now, the flashing lights and chaos of earlier fading into the background. He couldn't shake the images from his mind. The gun pressed against his temple, the knife glinting in the dim light, the men's hateful words echoing in his ears. As he pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of his modest home brought a fleeting sense of relief. The porch light glowed softly, a beacon of comfort in the darkness. He sat in the car for a moment, staring at the house, gathering the strength to face his family. They didn't know what had happened tonight, and he wasn't sure how much he wanted to tell them. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked to the door. Inside, his wife, Maria, was waiting for him. She looked up from the couch, her face lighting up when she saw him. "You're home," she said, standing to greet him, but her smile faltered as she noticed his pale complexion and the tension in his body. "Daniel, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," he said quickly, forcing a small smile. "It was just a rough night." Maria stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "What happened? Did someone hurt you?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing I couldn't handle," he said, his voice steady but tired. "I just need some rest." Their daughter, Lily, peeked out from behind the hallway, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Daddy, you're home?" she mumbled, her voice soft. Daniel crouched down and opened his arms, and she ran to him, wrapping her small arms around his neck. He held her tightly, closing his eyes as a wave of emotion washed over him. For a moment, he let himself feel the fear, the relief, and the gratitude for simply being alive. After putting Lily back to bed, Daniel returned to the living room where Maria had made him a cup of tea. She sat beside him on the couch, waiting patiently for him to speak. Finally, he broke the silence. "I had some passengers tonight," he began, his voice low. "They weren't just rude, they were dangerous. One of them had a knife, another had a gun." Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Daniel, why didn't you call the police?" "I did," he said. "Well, not exactly. There's an emergency button in the car. I pressed it when they weren't looking. The police showed up just in time." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I can't believe this happened to you. What if they hadn't shown up? What if—" "They did," Daniel interrupted gently, placing a hand on hers. "And I'm here. That's all that matters." She nodded, though her face was still clouded with worry. "You're so brave," she whispered. "I don't know how you stayed so calm." "I had to," Daniel said simply. "For you. For Lily." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the night settling over them. Daniel sipped his tea, letting the warmth soothe him. He thought about the men, their hatred, their anger, and the way they had tried to strip him of his dignity. But he also thought about the moment the police arrived, the look of fear that had replaced their smug confidence. He had survived, and they had been taken away in handcuffs. As he prepared for bed, Daniel reflected on the deeper implications of what had happened. He knew that racism and hatred weren't going to disappear overnight. He had lived with them his entire life, and tonight was just another reminder of the challenges he faced every day. But he also knew that he couldn't let fear or hate dictate his life. The next morning, Daniel woke up feeling more grounded. He hugged Maria and Lily tightly before heading out for another day. The world hadn't changed overnight, but he had. The events of the previous night had shown him the strength he carried within himself, the resolve to stand firm in the face of adversity. As he climbed into his taxi and started the engine, Daniel glanced at the rearview mirror, his own reflection staring back at him. He smiled faintly. No matter what the day brought, he was ready to face it. He had survived the worst, and he would keep moving forward, one ride at a time. This story shows the power of staying calm and brave even in the face of hatred. What would you have done in Daniel's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this.